In the shadowy world of World War II espionage, where deception and counter-deception decided the fates of nations, one operation stands apart as a monument to catastrophic failure. The Englandspiel, known to the Germans as Operation North Pole, remains to this day the most devastating intelligence disaster in the history of special operations. Between 1942 and 1944, 54 brave Dutch agents, trained by Britain's Special Operations Executive, parachuted into Nazi-occupied Netherlands expecting to join a thriving resistance network. Instead, they dropped straight into German hands. Of these 54 agents, 50 would never return home. They would die in the gas chambers and execution grounds of Mauthausen concentration camp, victims not just of Nazi brutality, but of an intelligence failure so complete, so inexplicable, that it haunts the intelligence community to this very day. This is not simply a story of German cunning or Allied incompetence. It is a tale of missed warnings, ignored security protocols, bureaucratic rivalry, and the terrible human cost when the machinery of war values secrecy over the lives of its own agents. The Englandspiel would claim not only the lives of 50 SOE agents, but also those of numerous Dutch civilians who dared to help them, more than 50 Royal Air Force personnel whose aircraft were shot down delivering supplies to fake resistance networks, and the future effectiveness of the Dutch resistance movement itself. The operation's success would deny the Allies a functioning underground network in the Netherlands precisely when it was needed most, during the disastrous Operation Market Garden in 1944. The story begins in 1940, in the darkest days of World War II, when Britain stood alone against Nazi tyranny. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, understanding that conventional warfare alone could not defeat Hitler, issued a directive that would change the nature of the conflict. He called for the creation of a new organization that would, in his words, set Europe ablaze. This organization would become the Special Operations Executive, or SO, tasked with conducting irregular warfare, sabotage, and subversion behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. The Netherlands presented both an opportunity and a challenge for SOE operations. Occupied since May 1940, when German forces had crushed Dutch resistance in just 5 days, the Netherlands was strategically vital. Its ports, industries, and geography made it a crucial component of the German war machine. A strong Dutch resistance, properly armed and coordinated, could strike at German supply lines, gather intelligence on V-weapon development, and prepare for the eventual Allied invasion of Europe. The Dutch people had shown their spirit of resistance in scattered acts of defiance, but they lacked leadership, coordination, and most crucially, weapons. Section N was created within SOE, specifically to handle Dutch operations. The plan was ambitious. Parachute trained agents into the occupied Netherlands, establish contact with local resistance groups, organize them into effective units, and supply them with weapons, explosives, and intelligence through regular airdrops. These agents would form the nucleus of a resistance army that could rise up to assist Allied forces when the liberation came. It was a sound strategy, one that would prove successful in France, Norway, and other occupied countries. But in the Netherlands, it would become a nightmare beyond imagination. The trap begins. First, captures and fatal mistakes. On the cold night of the 6th of November 1941, 2 SOE agents prepared to jump from a British aircraft over the occupied Netherlands. Huub Lauwers, a 27-year-old wireless operator, and Ties Taconis, a trained saboteur, were about to make history, though not in the way they hoped. They were among the first SOE agents to be dropped into Holland as part of the Plan for Holland initiative. Their mission was to make contact with nascent resistance groups, assess the situation on the ground, and begin building the foundation for organized resistance. The 2 men parachuted near Ommen in Overijssel and initially managed to establish themselves successfully. For several months, they operated undetected, making contacts and sending intelligence back to London. But the German security apparatus in the Netherlands was far more penetrating than London realized. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, working in coordination with the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service of the SS, had already begun to infiltrate the embryonic Dutch resistance movement. They had informants everywhere, and they were waiting. On the 6th of March, 1942, the trap snapped shut on Hubelauers. German security police, acting on information from an informer who had penetrated the underground network, arrested him. 3 days later, on March 9, they captured Tej Takonis as well. The Germans now had 2 SOE agents, their wireless equipment, their codes, and their instructions. What happened next would determine the course of one of the war's greatest deceptions. The Germans interrogated Lauers thoroughly. They knew the value of what they had captured. If they could force Lauers to continue sending messages to London, they could potentially control the entire SOE operation in the Netherlands. Initially, Lauers refused to cooperate, but the Germans applied pressure not just through interrogation, but through psychological manipulation. They convinced him that they already knew everything, that his codes had been broken, and that his only choice was between cooperation and execution. Faced with these pressures, Lauers made a decision that he hoped would save lives while still warning London. He agreed to send messages, but with a crucial omission. Every SOE wireless operator was trained to include security checks in their transmissions, deliberate errors that proved the operator was working freely and not under enemy control. There were typically 2 such checks, a primary check and a backup check. The absence of these checks was an unmistakable signal that the operator had been captured and was transmitting under duress. This was not a subtle system or one subject to interpretation. It was the most fundamental safeguard in the entire SOE communications protocol. If the security checks were missing, London was supposed to know immediately that the agent was compromised. Lauers sent his first message under German control, deliberately omitting both security checks. He was confident that SOE in London would recognize the warning and take appropriate action. Perhaps they would send a coded message acknowledging they understood his situation. Perhaps they would cease operations and evacuate any agents still at large. At the very least, they would stop sending more agents into what was clearly a compromised network. Instead, something inexplicable happened. Major Charles Blizzard, the head of SOE's Dutch section in London, received Lauers' message, noted the absence of security checks, and accepted it as genuine. He began transmitting instructions back to Lauers and continued planning to send more agents to the Netherlands. When another captured operator, Hendrik Jordan, was forced to transmit, he too omitted his security checks. Not only did London ignore this warning, but incredibly, they sent Jordan a message instructing him to teach his security check to his new operator. This meant the Germans now had access to security checks they hadn't even managed to extract through interrogation. Major Hermann Giskis of the Abwehr and Joseph Schreider of the Sicherheitsdienst could hardly believe their luck. They had expected to be caught after a few transmissions at most. Instead, London was not only accepting their deception, but actively helping them perfect it. Giskis immediately recognized the potential. This was not just a matter of capturing 1 or 2 agents. If London truly could not recognize compromised transmissions, the Germans could take control of the entire SOE operation in the Netherlands. They could capture every agent sent, seize every weapon shipment, and effectively prevent the formation of any real resistance network. Thus began Operation North Pole, or as the Germans called it, das Englandspiel, the England game. It would prove to be one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the entire war, the Operation Expanse. A web of deception, with the security protocol effectively broken, Giskis and Schreider set about constructing an elaborate deception. They didn't just want to capture agents. They wanted to create the illusion of a thriving, effective resistance network. This would require careful management of the wireless links, creation of plausible resistance activities, and coordination of reception committees for incoming agents and supply drops. The Germans created what they called reception committees at drop zones. When London radioed that a new agent would be parachuting in, German officers dressed as Dutch resistance fighters would be waiting at the coordinates. The arriving agent, expecting friendly faces, would land directly into enemy hands. The operations were conducted with such professionalism that many agents never realized they were being captured until it was too late. Some were arrested immediately upon landing. Others were allowed to operate for a few days or weeks, during which time they revealed their contacts and methods before being taken into custody. Throughout the summer and fall of 1942, the pace of operations accelerated. Agent after agent parachuted into the Netherlands, each one captured either immediately or within days. By the end of 1942, the Germans controlled multiple wireless links to London and had captured more than a dozen agents. And still, London continued sending more. The Germans were meticulous in their deception. They requested supplies that a real resistance would need: weapons, explosives, radio equipment, money, and more agents with specialized skills. London complied eagerly, pleased that their Dutch networks seemed so active and effective. Aircraft made regular supply runs over the Netherlands, dropping containers of arms and equipment. All of it went straight to the Germans. By the end of Operation North Pole, the Germans had captured over 15,000 rifles, 5,000 pistols, 2,000 machine guns, 75 radio transmitters, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, and tons of explosives. This arsenal represented a significant portion of SOE supply allocation for all operations. The captured agents were held in generally decent conditions, initially at Haren Prison in Nord-Brabant. The Germans treated them relatively well by concentration camp standards, providing adequate food and not subjecting them to systematic abuse. This was partly pragmatic. The Germans wanted the agents to remain healthy enough to provide information and to potentially assist in the deception. But it also reflected the Abwehr's more traditional military intelligence approach, as opposed to the brutal methods of the SS. The prisoners at Haren were completely isolated from the outside world, but they communicated with each other through an ingenious system of knocking signals on the walls and floors. They shared information about their captures, compared notes on the operation, and gradually came to understand the full scope of the disaster. They realized that London was either unaware of the German control or, more terrifyingly, might somehow be deliberately sacrificing them. Throughout 1943, the operation continued to expand. More agents arrived, more supplies were captured, and the German-controlled resistance networks grew increasingly elaborate on paper. The Germans submitted detailed reports of sabotage operations, resistance organization, and intelligence gathering. They created fake resistance cells with believable names and plausible activities. They requested specific types of agents: wireless operators, saboteurs, organizers, couriers. London sent them all. Some of the agents showed remarkable courage, even after capture. Several attempted to escape or to warn London through coded messages. Hublauers made multiple attempts to signal his captivity, including using the word "caught" as part of his transmission preambles. Other agents tried subtle variations in their transmission styles, hoping London's cryptographers would notice. But all these warnings went unheeded. The scale of the deception was staggering. By the spring of 1943, London believed they had established multiple resistance networks across the Netherlands, comprising hundreds of active agents and thousands of potential resistors. In reality, virtually the entire SOE operation in the Netherlands was under German control. The few Dutch agents who had not been captured were operating completely independently, with no connection to London and no knowledge that the SOE networks they heard about were German fabrications. One of the most tragic aspects of the Englandspiel was the false hope it generated in London. SOE headquarters produced optimistic reports about resistance activities in the Netherlands. A memo from May 1943 proudly declared, "The sabotage organization as planned is now complete. It comprises 5 groups containing 62 cells and totaling some 420 men. These groups are now well equipped with stores and are ready for action." Every word of this assessment was false. There were no groups, no cells, no equipped men ready for action. There was only German deception and doomed agents. The unraveling. Escape, denial, and truth. By late 1943, cracks were beginning to appear in the German operation. The Royal Air Force, which provided the aircraft and crews for SOE supply missions, had grown increasingly concerned about the high loss rate of planes over the Netherlands. Aircraft were being shot down with alarming regularity. suggesting that the Germans had excellent intelligence about flight routes and drop zones. In May 1943, the RAF suspended SOE flights to the Netherlands due to these unacceptable losses. Within SOE itself, some individuals had begun to suspect that something was wrong. Leo Marx, the brilliant and unconventional head of SOE's cryptography section, had been analyzing the Dutch transmissions with growing alarm. In January 1943, he wrote a detailed report to SOE leadership outlining his concerns that all, or nearly all, of the Dutch agents were in German hands. His evidence was compelling. The systematic absence of security checks, unusual patterns in transmission styles, and the implausible success rate of the Dutch networks compared to operations in other countries. But Marx's warnings fell on deaf ears. The Dutch section leadership, particularly Major Blizzard and his successor Major Seymour Bingham, rejected the concerns. They had various explanations for the missing security checks. Perhaps the agents had forgotten them in the stress of operations. Perhaps they were intentionally leaving them out to save time on dangerous transmissions. Perhaps the checks had been garbled in transmission. These explanations were thin to the point of transparency, but they allowed the operations to continue. The failure to act on Marx's warnings points to deeper problems within SOE. There was intense rivalry between SOE and the older, more established Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6. Both organizations jealously guarded their areas of responsibility and were reluctant to admit failures that might strengthen their rival's position. Additionally, the Dutch section had invested tremendous resources and prestige in the Netherlands operation. Admitting it was compromised would mean acknowledging a catastrophic failure of leadership. The truth came from an unexpected source. On the night of August 29 to 30, 1943, 2 Dutch agents managed a daring escape from Harn prison. Pieter Dorlijn and Johan Ben Ubbink were able to overcome their guards and flee the facility. What followed was an odyssey across occupied Europe that would finally expose Operation North Pole to the Allies. Dorlijn and Ubbink made their way through the Netherlands with the help of genuine resistance members who were operating independently of the compromised SOE networks. They crossed into Belgium, then into France, always one step ahead of German pursuit. Eventually, they reached Switzerland, where they made contact with the Dutch legation. There, they reported the full details of the Englandspiel, the systematic capture of agents, the German control of radio links, the fake resistance networks, everything. The Dutch officials in Switzerland were horrified and immediately passed the information to the British government. But Dorlijn and Ubbink's ordeal was not over. They used an established escape line to travel through Spain to Gibraltar and finally to London, arriving in late 1943. They expected to be received as heroes who had exposed a critical security breach. Instead, they were arrested immediately upon arrival. Herman Giskus, anticipating their escape and arrival in London, had sent a message, ostensibly, from another captured SOE agent claiming that Dorlijn and Ubbink were German double agents being sent to infiltrate Allied intelligence. Both men were imprisoned and interrogated as suspected traitors. They remained in British custody until after the Normandy invasion in June 1944, when the impossibility of maintaining the deception finally convinced authorities of their innocence. The treatment of Dorlijn and Ubbink exemplifies the deep institutional denial surrounding Operation North Pole. Even when confronted with direct testimony from escaped agents, SOE leadership refused to accept that their Dutch operations were compromised. It would later emerge that some officials suspected the 2 men were genuine, but interdepartmental politics and fear of scandal prevented appropriate action. By late 1943, even the Germans recognized that Operation North Pole was running its course. The RAF had stopped flights, fewer new agents were being sent, and the transmissions from London had become routine and less informative. Gisks decided to end the operation with a flourish. On the 1st of April 1944, April Fool's Day, he sent an unencrypted message to SOE headquarters in London. The message was a masterpiece of sarcasm. To Messrs. Blunt, Bingham, and Sucks Limited, London. In the last time you were trying to make business in Netherlands without our assistance, stop. We think this rather unfair in view of our long and successful cooperation as your sole agent stop. But never mind. Whenever you will come to pay a visit to the continent, you may be assured that you will be received with the same care and result as all those who you sent us before stop so long. The message was signed by Giscus. Operation North Pole was over. The Germans had successfully controlled the SOE Dutch operations for over 2 years. The final horror, Mauthausen and the executions. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in 1944, the fate of the captured SOE agents became increasingly dire. While held at Haren, they had been treated relatively well by the standards of Nazi captivity. But as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, the agents were no longer valuable intelligence assets. They were witnesses to war crimes and evidence of German counterintelligence operations. The decision was made at the highest levels to eliminate them. In September 1944, as Allied armies were pushing into Belgium and the failed Operation Market Garden was attempting to liberate the Netherlands, the 50 captured SOE agents were transported from Haren to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Mauthausen was one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system, classified as a grade 3 camp for prisoners who had hardly any chance for rehabilitation. It was a death camp in all but name, where prisoners were worked to death in granite quarries or executed outright. The agents arrived at Mauthausen on the 6th of September 1944. With them were 7 British agents who had been captured on other operations. The men were immediately taken to the bunker, the prison block, where the worst criminals and most important prisoners were held. They spent the night in cells, knowing that their fate was sealed. On the morning of September 6 and 7, 1944, the executions began. The exact details vary in different accounts, but the horror is consistent. The prisoners were taken from their cells in small groups, forced to strip to their underclothes, and driven to the Wiener Graben quarry at Mauthausen. This quarry was infamous for its stairs of death, 186 steep steps cut into the granite where prisoners were routinely worked to death, carrying heavy stone blocks. The agents were loaded with stone slabs, weighing up to 60 pounds, and forced to run up the stairs while SS guards and prisoner functionaries known as capos lined both sides, beating them with clubs and rifle butts. The run was repeated again and again. As the exhausted men stumbled and fell, they were shot. Marcus Blum, a British Jewish agent who had operated a clandestine radio in occupied Europe, was reportedly the first to die, shot in the head at point-blank range. Over the course of September 6 and 7, 1,947 agents were murdered, 40 Dutch and 7 British. Their bodies were taken to the camp crematorium and burned. In a final act of resistance and remembrance, other prisoners at Mauthausen, primarily Yugoslav and Russian inmates, secretly gathered the ashes and buried them in a spot behind the crematorium, at tremendous risk to themselves. After the war, this spot would be marked with a memorial plaque bearing the names of the victims. Of the 54 SOE agents sent to the Netherlands during Operation North Pole, only 4 survived the war. Some had managed to escape before being sent to Mauthausen. Others had been held in different facilities where they survived until liberation. But 50 men, trained professionals who had volunteered for the most dangerous service, died because the organization they trusted failed them at the most fundamental level. The executions at Mauthausen were part of a broader pattern of Nazi crimes against Allied agents and commandos. The Germans had issued the infamous Commando Order in 1942, directing that captured commandos and special forces personnel were to be executed immediately. While the Abwehr had initially resisted applying this order to SOE agents, by late 1944, with the Abwehr dissolved and absorbed into the SS, such protections no longer existed. Legacy. Lessons from disaster. When news of the Englandspiel finally became public after the war, it sparked outrage and demands for accountability. How could such a catastrophic failure have occurred? How could warnings have been ignored for so long? Why were proven security protocols abandoned? The aftermath of Operation North Pole would lead to fundamental changes in intelligence operations and create controversies that persist to this day. In the immediate aftermath, various conspiracy theories emerged. Some in the Netherlands accused the British of deliberately sacrificing Dutch agents as part of a deception plan to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would target the Netherlands rather than Normandy. This theory suggested that SOE knew about the German control but allowed it to continue to feed misinformation. However, this explanation is not supported by the evidence. The decision to invade at Normandy was not made until late in the Englandspiel operation, and there is no indication that the deception was deliberate. A more sinister conspiracy theory alleged that the Dutch government in exile in London cooperated with the British to eliminate Dutch resistance members suspected of communist sympathies. This theory, while reflecting real political tensions, has no factual basis and insults the memory of the agents who died. The most widely accepted explanation, articulated by historian M.R.D. Foote and others, is simpler and more damning. The agents were victims of effective German intelligence work, combined with stunning incompetence and bureaucratic failure in London. Several factors contributed to the disaster. First, there was the fundamental failure to respect and enforce security protocols. The security check system was designed precisely to prevent the kind of disaster that occurred. When agents consistently transmitted without security checks, this should have triggered immediate investigation and suspension of operations. Instead, the warnings were rationalized away. Second, there was an organizational culture that prioritized operations over security. SOE leadership was under pressure to show results, to prove the value of special operations, and to justify their existence in competition with other intelligence services. This created an incentive to overlook warning signs and to maintain optimistic assessments of operations, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Third, there was insufficient oversight and quality control. Leo Marx's warnings in January 1943 should have triggered a comprehensive investigation by independent analysts. Instead, the Dutch section was allowed to evaluate its own operations, an obvious conflict of interest. Fourth, there was damaging rivalry between British intelligence services. SOE and MI6 competed for resources and prestige, rather than cooperating to ensure security. Information was not shared, and failures were covered up rather than addressed. The impact of the Englandspiel extended far beyond the direct casualties. The operation effectively destroyed the possibility of organized SOE-backed resistance in the Netherlands for critical years. When the Allies launched Operation Market Garden in September 1944, attempting to seize bridges in the Netherlands and open a route into Germany, they could not rely on significant help from the Dutch resistance. The resistance that did exist was fragmented, poorly armed, and disconnected from Allied intelligence. This contributed to the failure of Market Garden, one of the worst Allied defeats in Western Europe. The operation also had a devastating effect on RAF Bomber Command. More than 50 aircrew members died in planes, shot down during supply runs to the compromised networks. These were experienced pilots and crew members whose loss diminished the RAF's operational capability. Additionally, information gathered during the Englandspiel allowed the Germans to penetrate resistance networks in other countries. They used intelligence from captured Dutch agents to infiltrate parts of the Prosper network in France, leading to further captures and executions. The ripple effects of the disaster extended across occupied Europe. After the war, investigations were conducted, but accountability was limited. Major Blizzard and Major Bingham, the successive heads of the Dutch section, faced criticism but no serious consequences. The full details of the operation were classified for decades, preventing a thorough public accounting. Herman Giskus, the Abwehr mastermind behind Operation North Pole, was arrested by the British, but later employed by the United States during the occupation of Germany, his expertise valued despite his role in the deaths of Allied agents. Today, memorials in the Netherlands honor the fallen agents. The most prominent is the Englandspiel Monument in The Hague, also known as the Fall of Icarus, created by sculptor Titus Leeser. The inscription reads, "They jumped to their death for our freedom." At Mauthausen, plaques mark the spot where the ashes of the executed agents were buried, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. The agents who died in Operation North Pole were not naive or incompetent. They were highly trained professionals who volunteered for extremely dangerous work out of dedication to defeating Nazi tyranny. They were betrayed not by their own failings, but by systemic failures in the organization that sent them to their deaths. The lessons of the Englandspiel remain relevant today. Intelligence operations require rigorous adherence to security protocols. Even when doing so, is inconvenient or slows operations. Warning signs must be investigated, not explained away. Organizational culture must prioritize security over political considerations and internal competition. And most fundamentally, agencies that send people into danger have an absolute moral obligation to take every possible precaution to protect them. The story of Operation North Pole is a tragedy on multiple levels. A tragedy for the 50 brave men who died. A tragedy for their families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers. A tragedy for the Dutch people who were denied effective resistance leadership when they needed it most. And a tragedy of institutional failure that should serve as a permanent warning to intelligence services everywhere. In the end, the Englandspiel stands as a testament to both the courage of the agents who volunteered for special operations and the terrible consequences when the organizations that command them fail in their duty of care. The names of Huub Lauwers, Thijs Tekonis, Peter Derlijn, and all the others who served in the Dutch section of SOE deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as heroes who did their duty even when those who sent them did not do theirs. Their sacrifice reminds us that in the shadowy world of intelligence and special operations, where deception is the norm and truth is often the first casualty, the most important principle must always be the protection of those who risk everything in service of their cause. When that principle is abandoned, disaster follows, and the cost is measured in lives that can never be recovered and trust that can never be fully restored. The Englandspiel was, in the words of historian Leo Marx, a textbook illustration the world over in how not to conduct clandestine work. It remains the deadliest intelligence disaster in special operations history, a cautionary tale that should be studied by every intelligence professional, and a memorial to the 50 brave men whose deaths should not have been in vain, but who died nonetheless because their warnings were ignored and their safety was sacrificed to bureaucratic pride. Their memory demands that we do better. Their sacrifice requires that we learn from this disaster. And their courage inspires us to ensure that those who serve in the most dangerous operations of all, those who go into enemy territory with nothing but their training and their conviction, receive the protection and support they deserve. That is the true legacy of the Englandspiel, and it is a legacy we must never forget.